Right, good morning and welcome to this morning's meeting of the Scrutiny Commission. As is usual, I'd like to welcome everyone to the meeting. The meeting is being webcast live to the public, and for those not able to watch the footage live, the webcast will be available for viewing on the County Council's website after the meeting. Can I remind members and officers to switch their microphones on when speaking, and don't forget to turn them off when you've finished. We've got two substitutes, Mrs. Seaton in place of Mr. Pearson today, and Mrs. Richardson is here for Mrs. Wright. So that's for your information. Minutes, meeting held on the 17th of June. I propose that we approve the minutes. Are we all happy with those? I sign them as an accurate record. Thank you. Question time. There are no questions submitted. And item 3, there are no questions submitted under Standing Order 7.3 or 7.5 from members. I have no items to take as urgent items elsewhere on the agenda. So item 5, declarations of interest in respect of items on the agenda. Does anybody wish to declare an interest? There is some possible reference to district councils, I think, in the council tax issues. Do we all want to declare a non-prejudicial standard, those that are double-hatted, twin-hatted members? Is that okay? Does anybody else want to declare an interest? No. That takes us then to declarations of the party whip. Are there any? No. I haven't received any petitions under item 7 today. So that takes us to item 8, which is the first item for us to consider today, and it's the provisional revenue and capital outturn. So we need to remember this relates to the budget for last year. The accounts are now being finalised, and as is usual, we receive a report on how they've finished the year, where there's been overspends and underspends, and I will invite Chris Tambini and Declan Keegan to present the report. Who wants to go first?
Can I kick off with a bit of an apology? I'm going to have to leave at 5 to 11, but Declan will be around for a little while. I've got to get to London for a fair funding meeting, so I thought I'd better get to that one. Yeah. So what we're thinking of doing is, excuse me, just doing a fairly short introduction, so there's a bit of time for questioning while I'm around, and then get onto the capital probably when I've gone, if that's okay. So I'll pass you over to Declan for the introduction.
The last time we came to scrutiny with the outturn was sort of, or not outturn, but the forecast was period 10 in March. So I was only going to pick up on the key variances rather than going through the whole report. So the first one was sort of the high needs block, which was an issue all year, which the overspend increased by about 400,000, although it had been up and down all year. So we did finish at 2.4 million in excess of the funding available for the high needs block. The changes were on individual issues rather than a new issue. In terms of resolving that for the current financial year, the £3 million was transferred from the school block in the current year, meaning that we don't start off the current year behind, as it were. And the project to resolve the sort of the cost control in this area is actually starting to show signs of sort of promise so far. So it's looking a bit more hopeful for the current financial year in terms of being balanced. Sticking in the sort of the children's department, the other key variance in there we'd seen all year was the placement underspend. That had increased by £500,000 to 1.2 million, although it is worth remembering that was off the back of an £8 million growth inclusion from the year before, so it is sort of still a big net increase. We do expect that sort of underspend to get consumed this year because the growth rate of 8% of the sort of looked after children is kind of being maintained of what we can see so far. So there are still concerns in the current year. And that growth pressure is sort of putting pressure on the external market in terms of being able to get secure places at the right prices. So children's a bit of a mixed bag. Moving into adults, we obviously had a significant underspend throughout the year. That did increase by 5 million to 11 million over the final few periods. The main move on that was in the residential service, where additional health contributions removed the overspend of the service. And also service user contributions performed a lot more strongly than was expected. So that moved it from an overspend on residential to actually an underspend, which then drove that adults underspend significantly. E&T, the underspend also increased by about £500,000 to 1.6 by the time we got to the end of the year. This was a mixture, sort of the LED street lighting programme was accelerated, so that brought out more savings. But there was also some works were moved into the current financial year to help coordinate with other jobs. So there is a bit of a shift in cost over years. Corporate resources increased their underspend by 700k to 1.1 million. In truth, that was kind of lots and lots of bits and pieces that were, sort of a couple of 100,000 here, a couple of 100,000 there. The final big item was inflation, with about 1.5 million additional that wasn't required in the year. Part of this relates to, obviously, if you get a whole heap of underspend, it lowers your cost base, lowers your requirements. But also inflation from the time we set the budget just didn't increase as much as was expected through sort of all the different forecasts that was around at the time. Obviously, sort of the additional underspend allowed provided resources to be reallocated. So in the meeting, Cabinet's meeting in June, they did allocate a further 11 million of commitments. These are set out in the reports on paragraph 50. Also to try and get ahead of things and allow people to sort of more time to plan. From the current year's budget, they did allocate 10 million again at the June Cabinet meeting, and this is set out in paragraph 51 to allow more of the capital programme future developments to be delivered, where we've kind of got the need of, I suppose, of projects exceeds the funding available, so they've taken the opportunity in both those cases to provide more funding to those areas. And they were the key variants I was going to go through for now.
Right, okay, that's fairly brief. So we'll take some questions then. Just obviously the key thing that has been a concern is the special education needs. And notice, as you said, there's 1.9 million overspend there, but a range of actions are being taken. But I just kind of wondered what work has been done. I mean, in the end, we've got to manage on the budget we've got, but it could be that there isn't enough money in the system, and that actually the demand is there. The demand is forecast to rise. There are more children requiring special education needs support. So obviously we had an announcement 2 days ago that the funding is being looked at again, and I recall there was mention of special needs. That block was mentioned by the Secretary of State in her statement. And I know it's too early to know any detail of that, but do we have any information that kind of forecasts what level of need there is going forward? Has any work been done on that? Is demand rising, or are we hoping it's actually going to sort of tail off?
There's two bits in there that just pick up on the funding briefly. When the draft sort of funding announcement came out, it wasn't particularly favourable to us in that it saw us as very much as being on the sort of the floor of the funding, so there wasn't an expectation that we'd get any more over the sort of 4 years that were set out. Coupled with the fact, as you correctly touched, that the expectation is for further growth. We've seen it both on sort of the placements and on the SEN, that the growth in the population of students requiring additional support does outstrip the growth in the population of the county as a whole, and it is around that sort of similar kind of sort of maybe up to 8% type mark of what we've seen on the placements, although it's harder to see because of the different categories of growth. So we do have that situation where the funding doesn't look like it's going to improve particularly, but the underlying growth is going to improve. So a lot of the focus is around trying to reduce the average cost of those sort of placements, or so you either keep them in sort of the mainstream school or use interventions sort of like they've got the Oakwood school to kind of provide that additional support to the mainstream school to keep out the more expensive independent placements. But there is that expectation of continued growth.
Right, that's interesting to know that. Can I just ask you on the Directorate's budget on page 36? Bit concerned that wasn't got a grip on, so we've ended up with a £500,000 overspend on the Directorate budget because there were delays in implementing the restructure. I presume that's to do with the director leaving, is it? Obviously, your costs go up when you have an interim, but even so, that seems to have gone on quite a while before. Is that under control now?
You're right. It relates to the fact that we've still got an interim director which obviously has a knock-on effect in terms of the structure beneath that director. So there was a kind of reorganisation plan that we based on, but there's little point in doing that until you have a permanent director in place, because they might well change it again. So that's the issue behind that.
Is that continuing? Because obviously now it's been decided that we're continuing with this arrangement for a longer period of time than initially was the case. So will that overspend continue?
Yeah, I mean, the two ADs are in place, so some of the issues have been resolved, but there is some pressure there still.
Right, who's got some questions then? Terry Ine.
Thank you, Chair. Fascinating report, lots to get hold of, but I wanted to concentrate on page 14, section 22. Adults and Communities has a net underspend of 10.9 million, which is not just a biggish sounding figure, it's also 7.9% of the budget, which seems quite a big proportion. And this just kind of doesn't fit, it feels, with what we're being told is the political reality. I certainly have had casework from residents whose elderly relatives have been asked to move from one care home to another to save us money, which that's somewhat worrying because, of course, moving people from one care home to another is associated with deterioration in their health and admission to hospital. And we've also been told in health scrutiny that we've got delayed transfers of care, not so much due to those people that we are completely responsible for, but being labelled as due to family choice. It could be said that we are not spending enough on, and that this underspend could be seen as perhaps neglecting our duties.
I suppose in some way I'm not qualified to comment on the detailed adult social care kind of issues. But my understanding of things like on the delayed transfers of care, we're not particularly in a high position compared to the rest of the country. I thought we were in a reasonably good position on that overall. And I think if you look at, the details of the underspend are kind of set out in the report. And I'm not going to go through that in detail, but you just need to go back a couple of years where we had a fairly sizable overspend on adults. And it's quite difficult to kind of forecast demand with any great certainty, particularly year to year. I think what we do know is that demand will be going up. You just need to look at the demographics of the county over the next kind of 15 years. I think the figure is there going to be 30,000 extra over 80-year-olds by 2033 or something like that. So it's difficult to kind of forecast year to year, but the trend is definitely kind of the fact that costs are going to increase. So that I think the pressure will be on. We have got an underspend this year, but I'll say demand just does go up and down, probably on an upward trajectory.
Just taking that a bit further, particularly the 5.9 million that Terry identified within the 10.9 on home care. I understand that part of that is because people decided to move to being sort of self-funders and to opt for direct payments and so on. So if that's the case, then what I don't understand is why direct payments is also underspent. Because if more people were taking up direct payments, wouldn't you expect that budget to have gone up rather than gone down?
In terms of that transfer between the home care budget and the direct payments, you're absolutely right. That did occur. We've got significantly less in home care, but that's kind of nil effect in here because we just did a budget transfer to try and keep things on a like-with-like basis. So that does leave you a valid question. Well, if you what's driving the overall underspend? And this was more to do with the overall increase in service users just didn't materialise. So at the start of the year, we applied, I don't have the figure to hand, but it's in the region of £6 million extra into the adults' budget on the assumption that the number of service users would keep coming up. When we don't see that, the numbers have stayed relatively flat. You end up with an underspend being driven here. So if you look year on year between inflation and growth, the expenditure in the department's probably fairly static as opposed to actually an overall decline.
What you're saying is then it was largely predicting additional demand that didn't materialise,
Yes.
rather than a reduction. Okay, so it's about forecasting, accurate forecasting. So what Chris is saying is it's still out there, it's going to come, but maybe it's going to come a bit later than they thought at first. Is that a fair assessment?
It is exactly that. It's very difficult to kind of forecast year on year. You know costs are going to go up. In any particular year, you might be constant, might go down a bit, might really shoot up a bit, but the long-term trend is going to be increasing costs. There's just no doubt about that.
Right, David Bill.
Thank you, Chairman. The difficulty with this agenda is that we know that there are problems, but it's difficult to know where to raise them on the agenda to be in accordance with the protocol. I mean, what we should be doing from here is learning from what happened last year and taking the lessons forward, and that sort of leads us into the next report. But to my way of thinking, there ought to be a reference somewhere, either here or in the next report, to the fact that the county's finances, and all local government finances, are now in a state of crisis, because we know that there's a massive Brexit bill coming. We know that there's a falling pound, and we know that the government, obviously, because of its tight legislative programme, doesn't seem to have thought about local government finance at all, unless there's some bill coming along. There was no mention of it in the Queen's speech. Therefore, we're definitely going to lose rate support grant, but there's no indication of the retention of business rates, which we were assured would happen. So where do we start to question the long-term stability of the county council, knowing that we face these problems?
So this report relates to obviously the previous financial year. You're asking about the future, and I guess that's going to be the next MTFS period, isn't it? What can you give us an indication, Chris, when will there be some scene setting? You normally have some scene setting in the autumn on that.
Yeah, the plan is to follow previous time scales, which is we'll take a report to Cabinet probably in September time that will set the scene in terms of the key issues and also set the timetable. At the moment, we are looking at more or less what we did last year, where we took a report to Cabinet in December and then it went through scrutiny and County Council in kind of January and February. That's what we're looking at. In terms of, I suppose, comment on the overall financial position of local government, the County Council, it is extremely difficult and extremely tight. There was an interesting thing, I just brought it along in the Financial Times this week, where the stress test they put on the banking sector, they applied exactly the same stress tests to public finances, just to see what would happen. And it's quite shocking, actually. I mean, what they said is if there is a recession and you have kind of things happen to interest rates, etc., on the back of that, they think that the deficit in 2021-22 could increase by 158 billion to getting on. I mean, that's higher than it was at the depths of the financial crisis with a bit of a recession. The consequences for public finance of that, I can't even kind of think what that would really mean. And you have to kind of remember, we haven't had a recession since 2010. That's a long time ago. Generally, there is a recession kind of every 10 years or so. So I think there's some huge risks out there in terms of the overall finances of the public sector. Never mind the kind of stuff that we know about now. So yeah, it is a huge concern to me personally, and I think to kind of most kind of treasurers in public sector organisations.
This is something we'll be coming back to, David, in the autumn, because this Commission's role is to monitor the overall financial position of the council and to look at forecasts and going forward with a new MTFS.
I mean, obviously this report is very detailed and it carries, and we should be questioning the detail under each heading, which obviously we're doing, but we need to be aware of the crisis which is coming. Could we have a copy of that? I have to admit I don't read the Financial Times every day, but I think I'd like to have a copy of that so that I can just try to grasp the enormity of the problems that we face. Because I mean, it's all very well just talking about underspends and being very happy with what we're doing, and that's. But if there's something thundering down the track towards us, yes. And obviously, whatever you do at fair funding, which I presume is part of this, we want to hear really what is there any prospect at all of any relief on the horizon that we can look forward to, because if not, we're facing any other body. If we were a private body, we'd be facing bankruptcy, wouldn't we? With those sort of figures around, we need to have a plan, don't we, to get us out of this?
Well, a couple of points. First thing I'll say is we are in a much better position than a lot of other authorities. There's no doubt about that. And the reason why we're in a better position is that we have planned, and we've taken the long-term position, and we've always thought that things weren't going to get particularly better. So, which has enabled us to plan. It has also enabled us to adjust when things happen. I know there was a school funding announcement yesterday where they were going to bring some extra money into schools, which is all very welcome. But the devil will be in the detail of where that money comes from. And it could well come from grants that possibly the county council were going to get. I noticed some were going to come from capital as well. So I think we do have a plan. We are in a better position than a lot of other organisations, but it's going to be exceptionally tough. There is no doubt about it.
Next.
Thank you, Chair. I think overall a good report. I think there's some good news stories in there. There's also some lessons that I think we could learn to take forward. And with that in mind, if I turn to page 26, section 101, main variances on the environment and transportation section, the overspend of £1 million. Question I'd just ask is, it was a major scheme. The overspend is explained in the text of paragraph 101. But I just wonder whether, as a county council, was that our own people doing it, or was it contractors that would have been involved in this on our behalf? Because an overspend of £1 million, I'm not too sure what the total cost of that scheme was, but it does seem quite excessive. It does explain the 1.8 million additional costs, but 0.8 million of that came from 106 monies from the Colville growth strategy. But it's just a case of, if it is a lesson to be learnt, is that using our own people, or is that using contractors, in which case presumably that's being looked at. Thank you.
I think we're going to have to get back to you separately on that. I haven't got the detail, but we can definitely write to you and let you know whether it's our own people or contractors. I imagine, given the scale of the scheme, it's going to be contractors, but we'll get back to
you. Thank you, Chairman. It relates slightly to page 29, the key achievements in the corporate programme. I see, obviously, we've bought another farm. I suppose my question relates to around our assets. I mean, we have substantial assets, particularly in property holdings, but I get no sense from this report about what the revenue income from those property holdings is, and therefore are we sweating our assets as effectively as we should do as a council to actually support our revenue budget by income streams? And I'm not sure where that information exists or how we access it.
To be honest, I think that's a really good point. We are planning in September to take a kind of asset investment fund strategy to Cabinet that's going to kind of set out the overall strategy in terms of our investment holdings, our current investment holdings, and also what we plan to do over the next kind of 3 or 4 or 5 years. And we have come to the conclusion that we do need to take a much more kind of a commercial approach to how we hold the assets, decisions we take around the assets, and also the basic information you're talking about in terms of, you know, the amount of surplus we make, the costs that are there. So we are going to be doing a lot of work around that, but there will be a report to Cabinet in September that will set out the basis for that. But we will be kind of putting in a much more commercial footing.
In due course, that's something we could ask for a report on in terms of how that's moving forward. Presumably what Cabinet's going to agree is to undertake the work, is it? Right? It's the beginning of the process, Chris, is it, rather than the end of it?
We haven't written the report yet, But I think that what we hope Cabinet will agree to is the broad strategy of around capital investment, because I think all members will know we have been purchasing assets like this farm, and we purchased some other assets to generate income to offset the need for savings in the future. So to agree that broad strategy and with a kind of financial envelope around it and how we're going to fund it, but also, as you say, how we kind of set the mechanism for how that all works and the performance information, etc., that goes with it.
Perhaps as an example, I mean, we bought a farm here for 3.5 million. What was our gross yield in terms of revenue income on that farm? And what is our criteria and what is our policy and what is our minimum gross yield that we're expecting as a council? I don't recall seeing anything in corporate governance that says this is the minimum gross yield we should be anticipating as a council when we actually purchase assets. So there's either a gross yield in terms of revenue income or there is an expected yield because of the value of that land going forward, which I agree might be difficult to ascertain. But I would have thought it should be possible in the short term to give us a figure which says this is what the yield is and this is what the income is on our assets.
All that will be in the strategy. I can't remember the figures of the yield on the farm, but it does relate to the risk. The risk of holding farm is kind of much lower than the risk of holding another property investment. So I think the overall yield we're going to be aiming for is going to be around the kind of 5-6% yield in terms of our overall kind of asset portfolio. But it will be stratified by risk. So there will be some that are kind of lower yielding because they've got lower risk and some that are high yielding because they're higher risk. But as I say, all that will be set out at that level of detail that you're talking about within our broad strategy.
And can I link that into my second question, which sort of quasi relates to page 16, paragraph 30. I think one of the things that concerns me, and I know a lot of residents and other council reported it, is if we look at the current state of our highways, I think without exception every one of them in the gullies has weeds growing and they're growing out the pavements. Now my concern is that we have a major cost that we're building up in repairing those, whereas a bit of weed spraying. So it's that linkage between underspends against future spends going. Now, with the government just having announced a £2 billion package at the LGA conference for work on non-motorways, if you like, or the non-highway network, I don't know how lack of maintenance to our own highways might preclude us from bidding for grants under that fund and have those two be linked together so that we're not stopping ourselves getting any money at that £2 billion pot because of a simple lack of weed sprayer going on gullies, which I would have thought could happily come out of the underspend.
The main area that does come up is, I suppose, the government does expect a certain competence or standard in sort of how you manage the asset of the highways, and they do grade you on levels. And I can't remember the exact phrase. I think it's something like the Highways Innovation Fund or something. But depending on the grade of level we are, the more funding we can access. And it does obviously help then when you sort of, if you've got that coordinated approach in terms of planning where the infrastructure is going to go, it obviously then helps in the grant. So I don't think on sort of the lower level kind of the weed type thing, it's going to impinge on the sort of the biggest schemes which tend to bid from the grants. But that probably does fit in with the sort of the thresholds that the government expects us to achieve in terms of actually how we plan for our sort of our maintenance, and that does access some additional sort of maintenance funding. But it is unfortunately one of the unavoidable things. If you look over the last sort of the series of cuts, a lot of them have fallen quite heavily on the sort of the highways side of things, where the amount of investment in highways maintenance has reduced as the savings have necessitated in the MTFS. Some of the underspends do get redirected there. So, for example, halfway through the year, when we were aware of the underspend was starting to build, 5 million did get reinvested back into highways to try and alleviate some of those cuts. But the trend is for downward spend on highways maintenance.
So that's in the context of going down from 25 million to 16 million, isn't it, that was agreed? So it's difficult to see how that's going to get any better if you're reducing the revenue budget by such a significant amount, unless, as you say, there are special government pots that we can bid into to try and offset it. Are you hopeful we'll get any of this money that was announced at the conference?
Well, I don't know whether we get it. I mean, it was announced by the Minister there was going to be a £2 billion fund that councils could apply for highways. My concern really is around that low-level maintenance may lead to huge additional capital costs going forward. Because if the edges of the roads are being destroyed, at some point you're going to have to repair them, as we are with the pavements where weeds are growing through. And I'm just concerned that a minimal amount, which it would be just spraying weed killer, for instance, and it's that linkage between what's our view on future capital costs of maintaining this against the revenue costs we're currently spending on things which could preclude that capital investment in the future. And I'm not sure in the report where that linkage exists either.
Spend money, small amounts of money on preventative to save spending bigger money to sort the problem out later.
I'm a simple councillor.
I think a lot of members have made that point to Cabinet previously, of all parties, saying, you know, why do we cut back on preventative? And I think the answer is because it's an easy cut. You can do it and you don't see it straight away, but you do see it in 5 years' time. That's the problem. Do you want to add anything?
The only thing I was going to add, I mean, is the thing they are trying to alleviate is take more of a sort of a highways asset management approach as opposed to sort of dealing sort of individual sort of issues. You try and deal with sort of an area or a multitude of issues together to sort of try and make better use of that money. But if you do want to get into that sort of balance between sort of the preventative or the sort of the reactive, it's probably one for sort of the highway sort of department themselves and how they manage that. But they probably will recognise that kind of if you do reduce the level of maintenance at some point, it is going to sort of cause other issues, and that's where I suppose they're trying to sort of the capital money they get is trying to make best use of that to avoid it. But it probably is more of you get into the detail of sort of how you manage the assets, which is probably more of a highways one than a finance one directly.
I think that's why I said it links to the previous question, because 3 million spent on the farm, if it gives us a 5% yield, if that money was spent on highways and saved us 10%, we'd be better off not buying the farm and doing the highways. Although I appreciate the farm gives us ongoing revenue income, whereas once you spend the money on the other, you spend it once. But because we then have to put it through an MRP, there is a revenue cost to fixing the highways.
Okay. Any other comments on this report? Rosita.
Thank you very much. And again, I must reiterate what a very good report it is. The details are just amazing. Page 29, main variances under the corporate programme. It's quite a large net slippage there. Could you elaborate what are the measures are we on track? What measures are being taken to get us on track? So just give me a quick rundown on that, if I may. And one thing I don't understand, page 43, coroners overspends relates primarily to the increased pressure on the Leicester City and South Leicestershire coroner service run by the Leicester City Council. So why is the overspend to us? Are there recharges? How does this work? Are we paying for the city's coroner service as well? Thank you.
So the first one around the corporate asset investment, or the slippage on the main variance on the corporate programme. So the main ones there, the Corporate Asset Investment Fund and Loughborough University Science Park, they fall under the umbrella of what Chris was talking about before in terms of the asset investments to try and gain a revenue return. They do tend to be quite, I suppose, lumpy, for want of a better word, in terms of you either spend several million or you don't spend anything. So they do come in these blocks and will either be sort of ahead or behind. But they are trying to, or the intention is, Chris touched on, to take the strategy in September, but to increase the rate at which we try and bring the opportunities forward, to try and bring the sort of the revenue benefits forward as well. So it is behind. It is one of these that's going to throw up big variance potentially either way. But there is an increased appetite to actually go out and find schemes. So we should get back on track in the next sort of couple of years in terms of being able to bring more forward.
May I come back, Chairman? So do I assume what you're saying, you invest in the first place in order to accumulate a higher yield at the end, or, you know, so is this like an investment to get eventually a very high return on those projects?
Yes, and it'll be a mixture. Some will be target investments to get sort of the annual rental income. Some will be investments to get sort of longer term capital growth, and some will be kind of a blend of the two. But both of those fall under that sort of umbrella with the added benefit. Obviously, the kind of the beneficial to the sort of the economy of the county as well. Sort of the Loughborough one particularly, obviously, sort of helping to sort of grow out the sort of side of the university and keep those sort of that grow on space for sort of new businesses. And the Colville Workspace project's obviously sort of a refresh of some of the assets we've held out there for sort of quite a few decades that are in need of renewal. So the intention of both of them would be to get a return back to the council. And the coroner's one, the county is covered by two coroner's areas. The sort of the north of the county covered by the sort of coroner in Loughborough is just fall under the county council, but the southern area that covers Rutland as well is managed by through the city council. So it does cover the city, and it also covers the southern areas of the county. So there is the difficulty they've got is that the main hospitals obviously are in the city, so there needs to be an allocation between kind of the city and the county. So if there's more costs in there, we do take a share of that, but it is an agreed basis for sharing. So they do manage that whole area on our behalf.
Just on that, I'd understood that we were looking at whether there was benefits in moving to one coroner's set up, you know, for the whole of the city and the county. Do you know if there's any work being still done on that?
The last I heard, it's a difficult one because I think you require primary legislation to change it, which is obviously sort of difficult to get through. But you're also in the situation where there's no sort of concept of sort of retiring a coroner. So until sort of one of the coroners said they've had enough, it's very hard to bring the two together. So I think the last I heard, it was almost in that holding pattern. If there was an opportunity, you'd look at it, but it's not something we could kind of proactively push.
May I just come back, Chairman? So this overspend is not pro rata. It is one full cost and then it's shared. You know, this is still quite, alien to me. So just explain how the cost is allocated across, because the report refers that it is due to an increased cost in the city. So
the cost, again, from memory, is very much on a population basis. So they'll take obviously sort of, if somebody dies in the city hospital, the coroner will have to sort of investigate that. But if the person was sort of the relate, or they lived in the sort of the south of the county, obviously that cost relates to us. But rather than doing it on an individual basis, they do it on a broad population basis, which helps smooth some of the ups and downs. So that 194,000 overspend is the whole of the overspend relating to the north of the county, plus the county council share of the city's coroner's cost. If that's what you were asking.
Terry, do you want to?
Can I just ask a quickie on the Colville Workspace project? It says it's due to planning delays.
So what page?
29, where we were with Councillor Page. The Colville Workspace project, as I understand it, one of the issues there is to refurbish an area which is currently used by a haulage company, which is then going to be required to move. So one of the things I'm concerned about here is that we could be in a position, if we don't sort this out, of actually inducing planning blight in Colville, which of course needs it least of anything. So I'd be interested if we could dig down at another opportunity to find out, where are these planning delays coming from? Is it the planning authority? Is it something that we are responsible for? We're not here just to make money for ourselves as the council. We're also here to benefit our communities. And if we're actually making the situation worse in Colville by blighting a haulage company and not providing anything else, that would be a poor use of our resources.
I'm afraid I don't know on that one. We'd have to get back to you in terms of the individual things. It is made up of the whole Colville sort of work is made up of a few different schemes, so there may be a few different bits and pieces, but we'd have to get back to you on that one.
Okay. Can I just ask you, that you referred to this extra 5 million that the Cabinet agreed for highways maintenance partway through the year? Does that have to be, is it effectively a list of schemes that they want to carry out, or is it just a sort of backfill cuts? In other words, is it possible to identify what works have been done as a result of that? Is there a list anywhere so that members could actually see what benefit that money's had?
Yes, there is. I'd have to get somebody to sort of send it through, but they effectively got added into the capital programme, as it were. But there is a breakdown of the whole 5 million.
Members would appreciate seeing that. So what is it that by putting that extra 5 million in, what have we been able to do that we couldn't do if that money hadn't been switched? That would be helpful to see that. Okay. Is there anything you want to add on capital? You have taken some questions. We normally separate the revenue part and the capital out. Is there anything else you want to draw to members' attention?
No, just apart from it was broadly a good year in terms of actually sort of getting spends completed. So we're up at the sort of the 95%, which we haven't touched on for a few years. So it was more positive in terms of actually sort of getting programmes mobilised and sort of and planned through. So but I'm happy to take any further questions.
Any further questions on the capital programme? David Bill.
This affects Stuart and myself and Michael, but there was a £10 million bid to improve the highway congestion in Hinckley to the Strategic Growth Fund, and that was totally rejected. Now there's only £800,000 in the fund at the moment to try to tackle what can be done. There's another bid going forward through the National Productivity Investment Fund, but if there is any available underspend within the capital programme, could I just put in a patch plea that £800,000 is boosted? Because personally I've got no confidence whatsoever that any money will be forthcoming through this latest bid, because quite frankly we don't get successful bids at all in our part of the county for projects of this nature. We do. I mean, I think the East Midlands does very badly anyway. Leicestershire doesn't do much better, and the Hinckley area gets the bottom, gets the worst of all when it comes to contributions. So if there's any underspend at all, I'd just like to put in that plea that some additional money is paid into that fund. Jim?
Now, you have a plea for additional resources for Hinckley. I'm sure.
We will all ask for some additional resources.
That was my point. Can I just raise a point? Chairman, we shouldn't be making bids for patches. I mean, it's up to this council to determine the need of where the money is best spent. We've all got areas. I mean, we need a bypass in Sharnford. I don't think we really should have members making individual pleas saying, can I have the underspend in my patch?
I think the need was determined because the bid was put into the growth fund, so the need was there, had been identified by technical officers in E&T. The problem was that what came back was far less than they bid for.
I mean, I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman, but there's lots of areas who've put in bids and haven't even got that far. And I would argue that Sharnford needs a bypass more than Hinckley needs some additional work on its roads, to be perfectly frank. But I wouldn't make that point here because it's the wrong place to make it.
We'll leave it at that. Right. If there's no further comments on this report, I'll thank Declan for the detail he's gone into. There are several items that you're going to get back to us on in written form. If we could circulate that through Rosemary, that would be great, and then it can go to all members. And thank you very much this morning. Right, so we'll move on to the next item, agenda item 9. Strategic plan, single outcomes framework. Just pause for a minute while Assistant Chief Executive Tom Pennell and Donna Worslip. Who'd like to kick off?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. The report provides an update on work underway to revise the Council's strategic plan and to seek the Commission's views on the strategic outcomes the Cabinet has identified as priorities for the Council for inclusion in the plan. The Council's existing strategic plan was approved in May 2014 and covers the period to 2018 next year, and the proposed new plan will cover the period up to 2021. In terms of the process to date, Cabinet has agreed 5 high-level strategic outcomes for stakeholder engagement and improved a stakeholder engagement exercise which is currently underway, and I think it concludes in early August. Is that right? Yeah. That Cabinet decision was preceded by consideration of the strategic plan and of the outcomes at a series of workshops involving senior managers from all council departments and discussion at the corporate management team. And the 5 outcomes are summarised in paragraph 14 of the report. The stakeholder engagement exercise has been supported by the preparation of a discussion document which is attached as Appendix A, and that starts at page 57 of your papers. That asks questions about the proposed vision, the principles for how we work, and the outcomes themselves. And ask those questions of stakeholders, and clearly the Commission is being invited to comment on those as well. The document has been sent to a wide range of stakeholders and is also being discussed at key partnership meetings. We're starting to receive comments. We've had a few in which have been positive so far. And the comments will obviously be taken fully into account when the plan is finalised. I think perhaps the key thing to note is that the main change between the proposed new plan and the one it replaces is that the new plan will have a greater focus on the outcomes of the Council's activities for Leicestershire's residents, communities and businesses, and that will be done by incorporating a single outcomes framework within the plan. And we believe there's a number of benefits that an outcomes-based approach can bring to the Council and to Leicestershire's people, places and businesses. So an outcomes-based approach, it will ensure a focus on the difference we make to citizens, to communities and businesses, and not on short-term outputs or processes. So it's really about the things that will make life better for people. It won't focus on producing the plan, but on the results that we achieve. It will enable activity and spend to be better aligned to achieving real and lasting benefits for people and communities. It will support better integration across departments because all departments will be working to support the agreed outcomes. And those outcomes aren't necessarily just delivered by one department. It will help us to align council activity with the agendas of partners and with national agendas. Importantly, it will also help us make decisions about commissioning and decommissioning activities. And will also enable the Council, including this Commission, to test the extent to which budgets are being spent against the agreed outcomes. So as I mentioned before, the 5 priority outcomes are summarised in paragraph 14, but they're also set out in more detail with a number of sub-outcomes relating to each in the appended discussion paper. I won't describe them in detail, but you'll see that they focus on having a strong economy, people being able to take control of their health and well-being, residents being protected from harm and being safe, having thriving integrated communities, and also having good quality and affordable homes. Once approved, the Council will prioritise and organise its activities in support of those outcomes, and clearly will be ensuring there's close alignment with other strategies, such as the MTFS, for example, which you've just been hearing about. And of course, the MTFS, as it exists, has fed into the thinking on the outcomes. In terms of the process moving forward, after the engagement exercise, we'll be looking at the comments that have been made. We'll be drafting the plan for consideration at Cabinet on the 15th of September, which will give the Commission an opportunity to look at it 2 days before then at your meeting on the 13th.
Right. Do you want to add anything? Or at this stage, you're happy to take questions. Right. Very high level, this, isn't it? It's very difficult to find anything that you would actually object to in it at all because... Okay. Well, oh, Rosie will. Okay. Well, but I guess the issue is going to be how is it going to be monitored? How's it going to be, you say in 6 years' time, how will we know if it's been successful? I think the second issue is you referred to the MTFS. So much of it is going to be dependent on whether the resources are available to make it happen. As we heard earlier, that's quite a pessimistic forecast from the Section 151 officer. So to what extent is it written that it can cope with further cuts?
I mean, you're right, Chairman, that the report is that the outcomes framework and the strategic plan are high level, and they are deliberately set out to be so as outcomes. What it doesn't do is propose a lot of additional activity that will need to be resourced with additional funding. So it's very much a mechanism for agreeing the council's priorities, couching those in terms of the benefits that will come, that will be experienced by local people, and ensuring that the council's resources, which are clearly constrained in the current climate, are aligned to those outcomes, and that the council's services are working to deliver those outcomes in a joined-up way. So the main benefit, I think, of an outcomes-based approach in terms of the MTFS is that it will enable us to make better use of the existing resources that we have, which will clearly help us with managing those pressures. This is really about maximising the outcomes for people within the context of the financial resources that we have at our disposal. In terms of how we're going to measure this, we'll clearly be working this up into more detail, and there will be performance measures, performance indicators put in place in relation to each of the outcomes as we take this forward.
David Slater first.
Thank you, Chairman. In answer to your question, do you agree with the 5 strategic outcomes for Leicestershire? I would say yes. And I agree with the Chairman that they are very high level, and I suspect that most councils in Leicestershire will have something very similar to these headings in their own plans. So my question relates around the fact that you mentioned working in partnership. To what extent are these issues aligned and complement those of our partners to ensure that there is unity in achieving them? Because, as I say, I think we all want to achieve them. And how, given that, I'll just pick on one, quality homes, the council here doesn't in the main provide homes. What levers does the county council have that it can pull and adjust, that when we do have performance indicators, if those performance indicators show an underachievement, what can we do as a county council considering the delivery is affected by somebody else?
Yes, thank you. In terms of partnership working, a couple of comments, I think. Firstly, clearly the outcomes have been informed by existing partnership working and existing partnership strategies that we have in place. So if you take the economy as one example, clearly the work that we do on to support the economy is done through a number of partnership arenas, including the local enterprise partnership, the work that's been undertaken on the strategic growth plan around future employment land and also around future housing land, and transport work again is done in partnership with colleagues at the city and other agencies. So the outcomes have taken account of the partnership arrangements that are already in place, but clearly through the engagement exercise we are asking partners to test our outcomes against the work that they're doing to check that we are aligned to their activities. I think also it's fair to say that in many of these areas, and perhaps economy is one of the better examples of that, is that this is work that we do in partnership with other organisations all of the time. In relation to the point about our levers, I think the housing one's an interesting one in that it, I think, highlights the benefits of taking an outcomes-based approach, because I think we don't have a housing department at the county council, and we're not a statutory, we're not a local housing authority, but housing is clearly an important facility for residents within the county, and it's a big determinant of people's quality of life. And the council has there are a number of ways in which the council influences the provision of housing in the county. And I think there was a discussion earlier about some of the infrastructure funds that are available, including for roads, whether it be in Hinckley or Sharnford or elsewhere. And the council, working with the LEP, working with the district councils, working with the city council, is seeking to access those infrastructure funds to support housing delivery and employment and economic development and employment delivery as well. So the council's work in that area very much supports the delivery of more and better housing in the future. Similarly, our property assets, there was also a discussion on farms, for example, where those are sold for future housing provision. That's another way in which the council supports housing provision, even though we don't, on the face of it, have a big role in relation to housing. And of course, there's the social care elements of housing as well, which is an important consideration for us too.
Right, I've got Terry Richardson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, like yourself and David, I can't disagree with the outcomes and what we're trying to achieve. I think we're all going in the same direction. The first part of my question just relates to logistics. I'm new to Scrutiny Commission, so you might need to humour me and just let me know. I'm just wondering what the process of this was. So, we're looking at this now when the consultation is already out. I would have thought, there would have been a list of consultees attached to this document so that we knew who it was. But who determined the list of consultees? Had Scrutiny Commission already seen the draft before it went out? And therefore, if it hadn't, what involvement was there from members in the consultation that was going out? So was there ability to increase the consultees or to slightly frame the questions differently in terms of what it is? Because one of the things that concerns me is looking back at things like our customer satisfaction survey, the level of response we get as a county is not great. And anything we can help all of us do to increase that has got to be beneficial. So it was just the logistics of it. Did it come here before it went out? Or is this the first time we've seen it? And I suppose it leads on to the second point, that seeing the final one 2 days before it goes to Cabinet strikes me as a bit too late, because what point is there? What is the ability to shape it? I'd also just like to make a comment on your earlier response to David's question, in that I think there's an awful lot that county could do in actually speeding up housing, in terms of one of the biggest issues here is speeding up the release of reserve matters on large developments, which would benefit both the county and districts in terms of revenue income from council tax. So one would like to think, and your comments please on, if that comes back as a major indicator, will the discussions be taken internally with Highways on could we not increase the resources there to speed up reserve matters and therefore greatly increase the revenue stream being brought forward to all authorities in the area?
So you've got evidence then that Highways are slow in replying on reserve matters?
Well, what we know is that there is quite often an extended delay. What we may not know is the full reason. So I'm not casting aspersions. I'm just saying, is it something we could look at so that if there are stoppages or delays taking place, could we all work together to increase it? This is coming back to David's point about teamwork across the county, because it's in all of our interests. So all I'm saying is, if there are issues, which there appear to be, anecdotally, we could work together to actually increase those for the benefit of all of us. So this isn't a go at county highways, this isn't a go at districts, this is coming back to the brief of this report, which is how can we all work better together for the benefit of the residents of Leicestershire.
Tom?
Yes, thank you. I mean, I can't answer the specific question about reserve matters, but just to say, so I think it's an example of where, if it was identified that there was a need to invest in that area because that would be an effective way of delivering the outcome more effectively, then that's clearly the sort of thing that an outcomes-based approach will help us to do, because that wouldn't obviously be an area that you would look at if you weren't taking an outcomes-based approach. I think it's fair to say. In terms of the process, this is the first time it's been to the Commission. the plan has been to bring the strategic plan and the single outcomes framework to the Commission twice. So once now, to comment on the the high level version, if you like, and a second time when the Cabinet is considering the final plan. So I think that's broadly in line with how other reports have been dealt with in the past. But clearly, we'll listen to any representations if more Scrutiny thinks it needs more time. In relation to those stakeholders being engaged, my memory is that there was a sort of a high-level list, if you like, of the types of stakeholders that would be engaged in the Cabinet report, and then that's been backed up with a more detailed list, which was agreed through the corporate management team. So it's not a full public consultation, for example, but it is an engagement with all of the district councils, all of our key partners in health, the police, and other agencies. MPs have been consulted as well. And so it's that sort of engagement, but we can certainly provide a list of who's been consulted if you would find that helpful.
Would you like to see a list of consultants?
I think what would be more useful, Mr. Chair, is rather than give us that, is when we actually get the final document, could we see the list at that time, and then with the percentage of responses we've had as well? Because, again, if there are consultees who are not responding, who we might have some influence with in our other areas, I think it behoves us all, as county councillors, to work together to get a wider response as possible. So if we can do anything to assist the officers in getting those responses, not perhaps now but in the future, I think that would be extremely useful.
Right, I've got Lee Brecken next.
Thank you, Chair. The background for the discussion document for stakeholder engagement, it discusses, it mentions key partners. No wording in there or mention of combined authorities. Is that on purpose? Is that something that's not on the agenda for this? Because surely going forward that would be quite a key player in making sure this document met what the purpose of the combined authorities was. So I was just surprised that there was no reference. I couldn't find a reference in the documentation related to that. So
clearly the combined authority, when it's established, and the Economic Growth Board, which is currently acting as the shadow combined authority, are going to be important players, particularly in delivering the economic outcome, but also the housing outcome as well. I would argue. I mean, I think across the outcomes, I don't think we've made sort of detailed references to I'm sure as soon as I say this, somebody will find one, but to things like the Health and Wellbeing Board and Safer Community Partnership and other partnerships. But clearly they're all very important, and the combined authorities as well. So I hope you wouldn't read the omission of reference to the combined authority as meaning anything other than we haven't gone into detail on all of the key partnerships.
I think, if I may, Chair, it was just obviously that the heading is referenced, and obviously that is driven by the combined authority process at the moment. So that was the reason for raising it.
No, that is the case, and we could have referred to the the heading being produced under that governance.
Right, Terry Einan.
Humpty Dumpty. So when I use a word, it means what I want it to mean. I have to take issue with this document. It is not an outcomes document at all. Outcomes, if it were anything to do with outcomes, I would see something that was specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, time boundary. These are not outcomes, they are aspirations. I wouldn't mind if it was called a strategic aspirations framework. As someone who has a particular interest in how outcomes are measured, I cannot support this document. I love the aspirations, nothing wrong with them, they're all very nice, all very motherhood and apple pie, but measuring progress is kind of tagged on the end as an afterthought. That's very depressing. Coming back on the assumption that it gets retitled as the Strategic Aspirations Framework, some of the aspirations are lovely, great communities. I would like to see something in that section about disability. We have had our Director of Public Health come to this council pointing out that people with at least one protective characteristic disability are being still unfairly discriminated against and finding it difficult to get work. It would be nice if we could actually measure an outcome on that, rather than just aspire to make life better for people with disabilities. And affordable quality homes. I think even on the telly they call it location, location, location or something like that. You know, where a house is matters. We label houses affordable, they still aren't. We have, I'm sure everyone who is also a district councillor has hundreds of people sitting on their council waiting lists because we may be building affordable homes but people can't afford them, and where we're building them is often completely unrelated to the areas of economic growth. So it'd be nice to have something about location in that section. I think that'll do for now.
Yeah, well, it's really it's not really you're making a statement about what you think about this plan, and it's going to end up at full council for approval. Is it not? Is that right, Tom? It's a framework document,
right, yes.
Isn't it? Yeah. So you're not happy with it, so I think you ought to be having some discussions with the cabinet member. You know, the officers are producing what they've been asked to produce by the cabinet. It's probably not fair to ask them to justify what is and wasn't, what is and isn't in the plan, because at the end of the day, the cabinet is responsible. This has been to the cabinet. It's been approved by the cabinet. I'm not disagreeing with you, Terry. I'm just saying that perhaps when this comes back, we ought to ask for the cabinet member to come to this commission, which we're entitled to do. Your questions might be better put in that context. That's something we can do if members wish to. Who is the cabinet member for this?
Yeah.
The leader?
Leader
right.
of the council.
Okay. So we would ask to have the leader come. Yeah.
I think, yes, to be fair on the officers, I think that's perfectly correct of the Chair to bring that to my attention. I am aware that this kind of guff comes down on councils like ours from even higher in the stratosphere, only to irritate people like myself. And yes, I think it does make it is political. It's probably even more political than, it's not party political, it's beyond, isn't it? It's about the kind of rubbish that Westminster come up with and decide that we should be doing down here. So yeah, it would be lovely. I'd very much like that, Simon, to have for the cabinet member. Not to attack him. I think we need to join together, join forces on this against these forces of Alice in Wonderland rubbish that local government are forced to do. Thank you.
Tom, we don't have to do this, do we? This is something that the county council's chosen to do. It's not a statutory requirement to produce these single outcomes. We've chosen to do that. Is that correct? And is it something that officers think will provide benefit if we get it right at the end?
Yes, you're right. This isn't something that we're required to produce, but I think it's expected of a large organisation like a council that will have a strategic plan that sets out our vision and what our priorities are. I sort of explained in my introduction the benefits of taking an outcomes-based approach, but I think also having a coherent strategic plan that sets out the council's priorities and sets a framework within which the council's activities are framed, so that we can ensure that the council's activities are meeting agreed priorities. That's always a helpful thing to have when, for example, bidding for funds or seeking to influence a government policy in to the benefit of the county. What I would just say, perhaps, to add to Councillor Einan's comments, I mean, the outcomes are aspirational. That's explicitly stated. But the delivery of the outcomes will be through more specific plans. So, the other plans that the council has will deliver the outcomes. But in future, those plans will make reference back to these high-level outcomes, and it will be important that what's in those plans meets these outcomes. And if there are things that are currently in plans which don't support these outcomes, then that's the sort of activity that could well be decommissioned in time. In relation to the comment about smart measures, we will be intending to put in place performance indicators relating to these outcomes, but of course we will also be doing that in relation to the more detailed action plans and strategies that will sit beneath this.
David Bill.
Concerns, Chairman, that about this document. I understand exactly what the officers are are seeking to achieve. But I do wonder how this will be received by people out there. You use the word vision, which is presumably meaning wherever we are now, we're going to be in an improved position. But I'm not so sure that it will be read like that. It says Leicestershire has a strong economy. Yes, it does. People are well and safe. We have great communities, and quality homes are affordable. That last phrase will be treated with some scorn, I think, because that might be the aim, but that's certainly not the position that we're in now. I'm concerned that the environment only gets a mention under terms of the economy, as if it's a sort of an afterthought rather than a basic requirement. And I rather would have preferred it to have been brought out as a main aim. We know, for example, because we met Severn Trent, just to give an example, we met Severn Trent in this room a fortnight ago, and they pointed out quite rightly that water is a finite resource, and that as we expand and build all these houses, we're going to have to think about where all the water's coming from that those people will require. And you can look at water, you can look at clean air. There's a whole range of environmental aspects which I think ought to be brought out if we are to improve the quality of life the people we seek to represent. It's not just a case of providing them with work. We want to ensure that the environment moving forward is in a fit state for us to pass on. There's a mention here, the priority outcomes about the economy is growing. Well, we've heard from Chris in the previous report that we face a crisis in our public services. The economy might be growing, but what role we're going to be able to play in that is questionable when so many services that we take for granted now are going to be under threat. What really does concern me, though, in addition to all of that, is our ability as members to influence these visions that we're putting forward. Because there was a time, I know I'm one of those who keeps looking back to a golden age which never existed, but at least we did, at one point, we were very much engaged with the other public services as well as the county council. We were closely engaged with the schools, the NHS, and the police. But those days have gone now. They've been taken away and are now run by various other, and in particular that relates to the schools and police. The NHS always was a bit of a difficult body to get engaged with, and it has improved slightly now. But when it comes to the bodies which we will need to succeed if we are to achieve this vision, I do not see how, as members or as a commission or even as a county council, we can seek to bring about the improvements we need. Take the school situation. Schools are now taken away from the county council, and if anything, they're moving further away because they've gone over to academies and multi-academies, and our input as county councillors is negligible, unless we happen to be on a governing board somewhere. The police we do not engage with at all, other than perhaps a once-a-year presentation by the Chief Constable and the Commissioner. We don't receive reports, and yet those two aspects of public life are essential if we're going to achieve the vision set out here. So we need to know how we're meant to influence these things or engage or find out what's going on even if we're to make sense out of this process that we're getting involved with. Thank you, Chairman.
I think you've raised some much wider issues than can be answered in this report, David. It goes to the fundamental heart of what we're here for. I think the key thing you've identified is how do we ensure that those other bodies actually are engaged in this and it's not just paying lip service, that they're genuinely part of this plan to deliver it. So you said that you came up with the stakeholders. Does it include schools? Tom, are we consulting schools?
We're not actually directly consulting the schools, but we are consulting the Educational Excellence Partnership. So there's representations of the development groups on there, and it's led from the Children and Family Service. So we've actually taken that direct to that partnership, and it does include representations of schools at each of the age stages.
I've never heard of that partnership, Chairman. It shows how much I try to keep involved with every public service that I think that helps the people I seek to represent. And yet I keep on hearing about other bodies which I've had no knowledge with. There's a position, we're getting more and more remote as county councillors, even if we try to maintain an interest. And I just find the whole situation
The Excellence Partnership was set up about 4 years ago by previous but one director, Gareth Williams, as a way to still engage with what you've described, the new setup and academies. And it was quite controversial, but it does exist. I think Ivan Old sits on it as cabinet member. Perhaps it's something that the Children's and Families Committee ought to go into in more detail, but that's obviously a separate issue. Is there anything else you want to add or can add, Tom, to David's wider comments about how we actually deliver the plan with stakeholders?
I mean, I think perhaps just the first thing to note is this is a strategic plan for the county council. It's not a multi-agency plan like we might have had in the days of local strategic partnerships. But clearly, we're only going to deliver these outcomes in the main by working closely with partners. Now, that close working does happen in many arenas through many partnerships, including the Educational Excellence Partnership and the Local Enterprise Partnership, the Health and Wellbeing Board, etc. So we'll be continuing to work as closely as possible with partners to achieve these outcomes. I think it's right. We can't make partner organisations do things, but clearly we want to work constructively with them to influence them, so that we go as far as possible in achieving these outcomes. And clearly we're consulting them on the outcomes themselves, so that we can try and make sure that their activities and ours are aligned. Just in relation to the comments about the environment, I think I should perhaps just point out that the environment is mentioned in several places, including on page 59, the final bullet point at the top, under the principles which guide our work, as well as under the economy section. It's also referenced under great communities, the final bullet, which talks about conserving the natural heritage, and also under affordable and quality homes, where again there's reference to environment at the end. So acknowledge that there isn't an environment outcome per se, but it is weaved into several of the other outcomes.
Right, I've still got 3 speakers. Rosa, you were next.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Now, I do appreciate that it is a high-level and aspirational report, and my first note was that how do we influence the outcomes, because that is the major issue here, that we must influence other partners. And I'm glad that Tom said that we are working very closely in order to achieve these outcomes. I've made quite a lot of points, but most of these have already been said. But I will reiterate a couple of things. One speaker prior mentioned the poor timing of this report. And I do think, whilst I said at the last report it was very comprehensive, I think there has been a lack of information in this. And maybe if we could have, as members, seen this report earlier, we could have probably aided a better, fully comprehensive report. For instance, on page 39, we are just simply going back to David's point about houses. There's enough suitable housing to support independence for those with social care needs. But what about people with disabilities? What about this council produced an extra care need report? We need extra care housing. We have to accommodate a rising, ageing population. So therefore, this can only happen as we can't deliver, we can only influence. We've got to make sure that the 7 districts have got all of our aspiration reflected in their local plans. And so we need to do that by constantly monitoring as well, not only the outcome or the aspirations, but how we deliver and how the partners deliver. Another issue which I like to pick up, it is also that homes are affordable, as David said. What are we doing to that? How are we actually encouraging developers? Now, going back, Tom said he's working with enterprise partnerships and LEPs, and I think that is where we have to lobby builders to provide affordable houses to buy. Now, my first question to Tom is, it says we listen to and empower local people, keep them informed and involve them in our plans. How? And where do we monitor that? Now, on page 60, we are saying that Leicestershire has a highly skilled and employable workforce. If you were to put that to the people in the ward I represent, where we have got low unemployment, but yet we have got loads and loads of temporary contracts, and people are only employed on a 13-week contract, I don't think they would agree. We need knowledge-based industry. So if we have an aspiration, we should include in that aspiration to create knowledge-based industry to keep the highly skilled and employable workforce in Leicestershire, rather for them to outcommute. So what are we doing there? My other point it is that it says that Leicestershire, that our aspiration is that Leicestershire has the right number and types of homes to meet the need and support the economic growth. Noted. But what about to meet the need, as I previously said, of the old, the young, to keep them in the district, and to ensure that there is a continual amount of affordable to buy houses? Now, my last point is that, Tom mentioned at several instances the partnership and the city. Now, I read out of this that this is a strategic plan for Leicestershire and the Leicestershire community. So what has it got to do with the city? If you can please reiterate that point to me. And I finish off by saying that I'm looking forward to the next report. I hope there are references made to how we monitor the responses, how many responses there are, because at the end of the day, this report is only of value if we have enough substantiated comments from the partners, because if we only get one comment or two comments, what was the point of the whole exercise? Thank you.
Rosie, just on your point about the strong economy and the skilled workforce, I may have misunderstood this, but my understanding is this is where we want to be when the plan's implemented, isn't it? This isn't a statement of where we are now. So you're saying, that there are areas where this is not the case, and
yes.
I would agree with you.
So what are we doing?
This is saying an objective of this plan is to ensure that Leicestershire has a highly skilled workforce. That's
yes.
correct, isn't it?
Yes.
So we know we've got work to do to make that happen.
Underneath it, what I'm saying, we need to set out what we're doing, how we're working with the enterprise partnership to ensure that there's knowledge-based businesses encouraged to come to the area. How are we doing that and how we're promoting that? Because we are having the high level of temporary jobs, because I understand there's a lot of need. So,
yes, on that point, this is an example where this sets out the high level outcomes, but beneath this we'll sit a more detailed plan, and the council currently has an enabling growth plan that sets out what the council's doing to support economic growth, working with partners. So what we'll be planning to do and what we've agreed to do is once the single outcomes framework and the strategic plan have been agreed, we're going to review the enabling growth plan, produce a new one which is aligned to these outcomes. So what that will need to do is to set out how each of those sub-outcomes, if that's how they're finally worded, are being supported by action that the council is taking. So I mean, I think it's a good example of where the high-level outcomes are here, but the detailed actions will follow later on in other policies and plans.
Thank you for that, Tom, if I may come back. But that is just, as I say, that it would have been nice to have known in this report that is where we're going. Then that would have saved us, bringing up these points. If you can answer my... so I assume that then answers all the rest of my questions, and I do apologise if I missed it. So I assume that that covers all the other points under housing and whatever I raised. So in your next report you will have sections that will point us to how you're going to deal with these issues. Do I understand you correctly?
Yes, certainly we can do that in terms of the actual plan itself, which will set out the final version of the outcome and the sub-outcomes, and we can set out how those will be taken forward in terms of partnership working and council policies and plans.
So how about monitoring the responses and how are we working? My other questions.
In relation to the responses, we'll report fully to Cabinet and to Scrutiny Commission on who we've consulted and who has responded, and the comments that have been made, so that we can take full account of those in finalising the plan. So I didn't quite catch the second part of that.
There was page 59 where you say we listen and empower local people, keep them informed in our plans, how and what's the process there, and the relationship of the city.
Yes, certainly that reference at the top of page 59, that's a proposed principle which will guide our work, which is saying that we will listen to and empower local people, and keep them informed, etc. And clearly a key mechanism for that will be the community strategy, which is currently being consulted on and will be coming back to Cabinet and Scrutiny in due course. And that will set out in more detail how the council works with communities, but also we would expect other policies and plans to take, to be local people to be consulted on those, and for them to have a say in how those plans are taken forward.
So will there be a plan for community engagement attached to this?
The community strategy will set out how the council will be engaging with communities in the future across all of its activities. If I could just perhaps come back to your point on what's this got to do with the city, I think was the question. And I think my response to that is that this is about improving the outcomes for people in the county, but sometimes the outcomes for people in the county are best achieved by working closely with colleagues in the city, whether that's, for example, on transport issues, on economic issues, where many of the jobs that people in the county hold are in the city and vice versa. And of course, we need to work with the join-in areas as well. But through the combined authority, through other mechanisms, we work closely with the city, and that's because we form part of a single economic area, a travel to work area, a housing market area, for example. So it makes sense to work with them on many of these issues. But we're doing that with a view to improving outcomes for the county's people.
Right, okay, I've still got 3 speakers, so we need to make some progress. David Jennings, you were next.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, most of what I was going to say has been said, but I want to highlight just one point, and please take it seriously. The priority areas are excellent, I support, but there is no point having a policy unless we can enforce it. And the affordable and quality homes section is one that does concern me. And when I say afford, I'm not talking about homes to rent, sometimes that's confused, but smaller properties for people who want to downsize, the kids have all gone and they want a smaller property, or it's people starting on the ladder of owning property for the very first time, perhaps the limited budget, they want small properties, but they want to buy them, not rent them. There's a big market out there for this, and it seems that all the districts, boroughs in Leicestershire are building lots of houses, there's no doubt about that, but are they building the right kind? And I would like to see some kind of targets. I mean, every council has a target for rented property, but I would like to see a target for the districts as well. I don't know if this is possible, where a certain percentages can be very misleading, so perhaps a percentage and the numbers of smaller properties for people to downsize and for people to get on the market for the first time. Very rarely a day goes by I'm not approached by somebody saying why they're building 4, 5 bedroom houses when we want other types of housing. And I would like some policy somewhere that we can have an influence about what is actually built. Thank you, John.
Yeah, okay, I think you raise a very interesting point there. Tom, does the Hedner go down to the needs of 3-bed, 4-bed, smaller housing and that sort of thing? Does it go down to that level of detail?
It does provide information on the need for affordable homes, using the government's definition of what affordable homes is. And I can't remember whether it goes down quite as far as that in terms of 2-bed, 3-bed, 4-bed houses, but it certainly talks about the need for smaller and large houses. So I can check on that and get back on that specific question.
And I mean, the normal advice you get from the planners is that's a market issue, and you can't, so when the detailed scheme comes in for 120 houses, and the majority is 4-bed, a couple of 5-bed, 3-bed, and then virtually very little or no bungalows and that sort of thing. I know they're land hungry. You're told, well, you've already granted the scheme in principle. This is for the market. It's for the builder to decide what they can sell. Is this something you think we can control?
I think the way the planning system is set up at the moment, it's very difficult to do that. Firstly, in terms of getting local plans through that have got very strict policies around that, and also then when planning applications come forward, local planning authorities being able to enforce that, given that obviously appeals are made to inspectors and those can be overturned. So I think the way that the planning system works at the moment means that is very difficult, and the whole issue of affordability generally, even if you accept the government's definition of affordability, it's still very, very difficult to get those affordable homes built in the numbers that they're needed.
Okay, I think it would be interesting to know what level of detail the Hedner goes into in terms of a breakdown of need on both affordable housing and, if possible, on market housing in terms of sizes. Is that,
provide that
could you have a
information?
look at that? Yeah, okay, thank you. Is that okay, David? Yeah. Mrs. Seaton.
Thank you, Chair. Mine's more of probably an observation rather than question, although it might stimulate a question. I'm well aware that this document that I'm looking at is to stimulate discussion rather than a questionnaire. But I do need to question the value of the answers that are going to be given, because they're all leading questions. To what extent do you think our principles, how much do you agree with? So obviously we're sending this out to targeted stakeholders, and with all the best will in the world, when you're faced with something like this, you go for the easy way out, and you'll just tick boxes and you'll agree with everything and say everything is, in my case, it would be banoffee pie, not apple pie. So I do question the validity or the value of any answers that you get from it, and I think that this to stimulate discussion is to stimulate agreement and confirmation of the aspiration of it. But of course we can't question the aspiration of it, because they are all aspirational and what we would want ourselves. But if you do want to get value out of it, I think that the questions need to be set completely differently to this. Thank you.
So, why are the questions a bit leading? Are they designed to get the answers we want?
I mean, with respect, I'm not sure that I agree that they are leading. I mean, I think they're fairly open. So, question one, asks the extent to which you agree or disagree with, with the vision, and we're asking people the extent to which they agree with with the principles and with the strategic outcomes. And then we've asked for people to, to provide more information about that. And clearly on the outcomes, we've specifically asked also whether people think that the sub outcomes, if you like, the bulleted outcomes, will, delivery of those will help support the strategic outcome above it. So I think the opportunity is there for respondents to take issue with the outcomes or with the sub outcomes. And to suggest that they might be different, as well as also, providing us with information on how well they align with their own priorities.
Perhaps yours is also one when we have the leader in September. Okay, Mrs. Richards.
Thank you, Chairman. One thing I would say, I do agree with Brenda in her thing about them being a little bit leading. But my main concern is that members haven't, this is the first time members are seeing this. It's a very, very brief outline of what the paper is meant to, the plan coming forward. And yet only 2 days are given to the Scrutiny Commission to actually look at all these things in detail. And I would suggest that this really should be given a lot more lead time for the Commission to actually review the paper when it's the plan when it's set.
Can I make a comment, because I think it's important for new members to understand. We can look at anything we want to look at. The problem is that the Cabinet obviously has the forward plan. You're aware of the forward plan. So once something's gone on the forward plan, we have a limited amount of time if we want to do it as pre-scrutiny. In other words, we want to scrutinise something before the decision's made rather than afterwards. So the Scrutiny Commissioners have to look at then how we're going to agenda this. So our hands are tied to the extent that we know that's going on the forward plan, we know it's there. So then what are our opportunities to look at it? So we can set our meetings pretty much when we want, but once it's gone on the forward plan, that's when the decision's going to be made, and we've got to fit in with it. And it is sometimes difficult to schedule something. I'm not quite sure why the meeting is on the 13th. If you're saying, would that be better if it was a week before, so that we'd have a bit more time to then feed any comments into Cabinet? That's something we could certainly look at. But generally speaking, we have to fit in with the Cabinet's decision-making timescale and hold our meetings and the issues we want to look at. I mean, clearly we can't look at everything that goes to Cabinet. We have to be selective. We just get bogged down in it. But certainly happy to look at whether, if the meeting on the 13th was brought forward at all, that would give us a bit more scope. Would that cause the officers any problem in terms of the final draft being available?
I don't think so. Depending on how far you brought it forward, clearly the report for Cabinet will need to be going out in early September in any case. So if we'll be working to having something for Cabinet by the end of August in any case. So if your meeting's any time in early September, then that will be ready for then.
I think, yes, thank you for that. I do understand the scheduling of meetings, but it's just with the amount of concerns people have had from here and not having had input already, I just felt it might be useful to give members a little more time for that.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we see a number of these strategic reports, and I can't remember one where members have raised so many concerns right across the whole both areas of the council. Concerns, obviously trying to be positive about this and improve it, but nevertheless there clearly is a feeling that the document does need further work and a bit of a lack of clarity about what we're hoping to achieve. Notwithstanding, obviously, it's ultimately linked to resources and what resources are available. But I think I've seen our officers taking lots of notes here, and I think it wouldn't be unhelpful if I sent a copy of these notes to the leader once they're available, just to give him a heads up of members' concerns, and that then we invite him to come to the next meeting. Is that okay? Right. If there's no other issues on this, can I thank the officers, who I think have done their best to present this to us this morning. This is something we will come back to. Final item on the agenda this morning is the annual complaints, corporate complaints and compliments annual report. We've got Simon Parsons, who's complaints manager. I'll ask Simon to introduce the report. I think it would be helpful if you could just set the context, because it's certainly something that is important members understand, that the different types of complaints, the statutory ones, and that this report is about everything that's not covered by the statutory process that we have our own system for. I would hope we would be done by then.
Thank you, Chair. So to set the context of this is the first of 3 annual reports that I produce on complaints. 2 are driven by statutory regulations and are in the adult and children's social care spheres, and both of those reports will go into the relevant scrutiny and overview committee groups later this year before publication. So this report focuses on everything that doesn't fit within the parameters of the defined parameters of either of the 2 social care arms. Inevitably, therefore, it heavily features environment and transport related complaints through this, which clearly have no kind of statutory place to go. So that's the background context of this. I won't go into the detail of the report, but instead we'll look to give an overview of the key indicators, key themes that are coming through this report. The first thing to say today is that for the first time in 5 years, we saw a decrease last year in the overall number of corporate complaints, a reasonably significant one of 20%. Now, as is usual, the main factor driving that down is driven by the Environment and Transport Department, and in there I'd highlight 2 key areas that contributed significant volumes last year, but have been significantly reduced this year, which is around grass cutting and around all things to do with traffic calming, safety, that sort of area. The reasons for that, a significant amount of work's gone into grass cutting in terms of improving information that's out there and available to the public. There's now mapping layers that residents can look at, quickly identify whether when next cuts are due, whether areas have already been reported, and those sort of things. And also there's been a lot of work in terms of the information that can quickly be given to residents when phoning our customer service centre. So often that is the result is lots more is getting resolved at the first point of contact, in the main front door of the customer service centre, and much less hitting the complaints area. So that's good to see, and shows the power of if we can get relevant and meaningful information available to our customer services team, they can deal efficiently and effectively with residents' queries and avoid frustrations that then subsequently are shown out in the intelligence that I see. Traffic management, the traffic safety area is slightly different in the sense of that's really all about work we've done about expectation management. So that's an area that notoriously takes a very long time for anything to happen on that. And indeed, I think it's in the high 90% of requests for traffic calming, typically in the form of yellow lines or speed restrictions, that sort of thing, is in the 90% that will never actually come to be delivered for a variety of factors that govern that process. So a lot of work's been done in terms of just not leaving that sort of false expectation hanging at day one that this will be a quick job, and that suddenly some lines will go down and that sort of thing, because that typically tended to be the reason it came into the complaints desk. I've heard nothing on my request, so there's an expectation here that this is straightforward, you'll be able to come and paint some lines, whereas the reality is it doesn't work like that. But similarly, being clear up front around that and just setting those expectations has significantly reduced the areas there. The one area we haven't yet really got a full grip on, and is the area that I would highlight coming through as the main sort of theme now, is around drainage-related complaints, where we continue to see significant volume coming into the system for a lot of the reasons we've articulated there. Clearly, drainage concerns are extremely emotive to residents that are suffering from drainage that may or may not be on their property, or certainly feel it could be, and speed of response, therefore, and clear responses are key in that area. And there's clearly work to do there. The typical stories that I see in my complaints are hear nothing, or they have a survey work gets undertaken quite quickly, but then seemingly goes into a void. So, and often this is because of the disjoin between the various processes along the way. Of different teams will do the surveying work to establish is there an issue, then has to get booked onto a schedule to then go and do the work and book traffic calming and that sort of thing. But unfortunately, we're not yet in a position where the customer's being kept in the loop around the various touch points are there. So there's work to be done there, which the director for E&T has fully accepted is an area that they need to prioritise for work, and is currently looking at a programme of work to improve that area. Other things that I would say, there has been some pressure this year, as articulated on page 95 of your papers, on timeliness of responses to complaints. Now that's clearly a key area of an effective complaints process. We've traditionally performed well in that area, but there is some sign of pressure through the last year around managers responding to that. In some ways, that's probably inevitable given some of the wholesale structural changes that have gone on in some of those departments. But it's an area that we need to be mindful of. With 69% of all complaints being resolved within 10 days, we actually still compare quite favourably to other county councils and counterparts that I speak with. But it's an area that we've dipped for the first time for a couple of years. So I'll be keeping an eye on that to make sure we keep the focus on improving that area. The other thing I'd recognise as an improvement this year is that we are seeing a gradual increase in managers being able to identify what I call systemic sort of improvements coming out of complaints, which is the other bit that residents would want to see in an effective complaints process, i.e. you're doing something with the feedback I'm giving you and you're improving results. I've articulated a couple of areas already where we've clearly demonstrated that. But we saw what my team try and do is chart through from managers' responses where we've been clearly able to identify actions that they will be taking to hopefully stop that issue happening again, which can be anything from staff training to revising information that's routinely sent out in either leaflets or letter templates, to at the very end level, of more complex level, a complete root and branch review of procedures, which occasionally happens. So what my team are doing is try and plot the progress of the percentage of responses where we were able to do that. And we saw an increase of 4%, so to 38% of cases where we can evidence some sort of systemic improvement. So that's going in the right direction, but more to do to try and drive through those and be really clear around what we can do, and that will remain a key focus. The other area that we've done a significant amount of work this year, although in the social care field, I mention it because it will have relevance to corporate complaints in future years, is where we've implemented a system whereby my quarterly reports that go through to the relevant departments now in social care get responded to. So unlike me just taking a report saying here's your complaints that you'll see and these are the key themes, I now ask for them to report back to me every quarter on what they're doing about those themes. And in time that will help articulate better exactly what steps have been taken, which sometimes as a complaints manager, you don't always get to see exactly what the department are doing in response to things. So that will help improve the intelligence in that area. In terms of complaints being looked at by the local government ombudsman, relatively low levels, certainly in the corporate sphere that they looked at. I'd just highlight one that we had a repeat. We had 2 cases where maladministration was found on a very specific a point around delayed entry panels, where the Ombudsman was critical of the application of our policy for a number of reasons, and that's been completely reviewed, a number of changes made that should see those issues not occur moving forward. But that's the one area that we saw repeated faults. And I guess the final thing I'd say is that it's important always to recognise that there's a lot of good work that goes on as well, and for that reason we try and balance this report with compliments, and we're getting close to parity in this report this year. So we recorded 253 compliments that my team received around service. This is very close to even on the number of complaints, so that's a good thing to see that, and we continue to push to make sure that the messages that we want to give that balanced approach, that we do get a lot of things right in a lot of times, and bringing that through. So I think those are the key points I'd raise, and welcome any questions.
Okay, thanks very much. I've got 2 speakers at the moment. First of all, Rosie.
Thank you, Simon. I must compliment you, because not only is this a very good report, but it is very good work. I think the figures actually bear that out. Now, a couple of comments. I actually like complaints, because complaints are the beginning of a learning curve. If we don't have any complaints, we don't know what's going wrong and where we can improve. So my first question is, if things are going wrong and if we find that out, what is normally the process? My second question, or rather comment, is the customer service centre. Now, the customer service centre is now second to none, and personally I even go through the customer service centre because I know then that the process is being dealt with quicker. I get an acknowledgement, and this is all positive. But I think it is really, really important to keep them all updated of recent events, and they can also guide you in the right direction to the website and whatever. So my second question there is, how often, or do they constantly get updated by the teams and trained? You mentioned environment and transport and grass cutting. Well, personally, I think a lot over the grass cutting is because parishes have taken on also their own grass cutting. But in this learning curve of environment and transport, where we see that there are still quite a lot of complaints coming through. So third question is that fed back into the budget process? You know, we're having the complaints here. It might be worth for you to put some more money into that area, or as another member mentioned earlier on, put some prevention measures in there. And lastly, we had 260 corporate complaints, 253 compliments, and I don't think in this report and otherwise you blow your trumpet enough, because at the end of the day, people are always ready to complain, but people are very rarely putting in compliments, and I am also at fault there. So there might be many more compliments, and what can you do to raise that profile and blow your trumpet that bit better, or at least in your next report? Thank you. Well done, Simon.
Thank you for that. So to respond to a couple of those, I'll start with the last one, the one around compliments. I think you're absolutely right. There will be other compliments out there that we're not seeing that are coming into the system. A couple of things just to touch on there. We are going to be doing some specific comms work around the annual report this year that I'm working with our communications manager around for that reason, around making sure that we stress that the positive performance going on. We will also be doing some internal communication around those messages, but reinforcing the need to keep those compliments coming back in. So hopefully that will see that coming through. In terms of the areas in highways that still need improvement, and is there a budget available for that? So the route there is that I would I take quarterly reports to the senior leadership team for each of the departments each quarter. And this, we had a conversation specifically around drainage, which is the big area at the last quarterly report. And from that, what I can say is that a programme of work has been commissioned on that. So I assume from that there is some budget that they've found and resource internally to do that work. I'm not able to articulate exactly what that looks like today, but certainly there's a commitment that they need to do that work and are resourcing that internally to do that. I think there's another point, there may be two, but the one that I recall was around, you just wanted some reassurance around the process where fault is found around what we do. So typically, and the guidance to managers on there is that where they find fault, they should be looking at a couple of things really. First and foremost, looking to put the customer back in the position they'd have been if that fault didn't happen. So looking at the immediate redress of whatever that may look like, and in accordance with kind of good practice guidance that the Ombudsman issues around remedies and advice and guidance on that. Beyond the immediate resolution of that, it's then looking around questioning why did that happen, why did the fault occur, and what can I do about it. Now, sometimes that will just genuinely be an administrative mistake that from an officer that's not a common theme, in which case it would be just a conversation. But sometimes it's much deeper than that, and sometimes actually what you see on the tin may not be actually the cause. So sometimes. So our advice is around just kind of really probe into that a little bit more to find out, what is that issue there, and then what can we do about that, and then either explore whether there is already some work going on to address that issue, or whether it is just specific work that those managers can do, and to respond to us as a complaints team, and we will then track those through and feed those into the annual report. I think I've answered all the points, but please do say if I've missed one.
No, customer service, very quickly. Are they constantly being updated and trained in order?
So on that, they should be, is the simple answer. So the processes and the mechanisms are in place that where inspectors are updating from anything they may have done. So an inspector may go out and visit and agree that some work needs to happen. What should be happening is in the field they should be putting real-time notes on that they've done that inspection and what's happening to that, and that should immediately then flow through into the customer service centre, who would have visibility of that notes. In reality, there are still occasions where investigators are either not putting on notes, or those notes are not of a sufficient quality. So that is an ongoing conversation that I know the head of customer services has with colleagues in environment department. What I can say, it's definitely an improving position in terms of the diligence of investigators putting those notes on, but still a bit of work to do to make sure that they're very clear to customer services what the situation is, and we've seen the benefits with, as I say, the grass cutting and other areas where they can quickly relay that back to the customer and often nip an escalating issue in the bud early.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, thank you for an excellent report, and I'm very pleased to see the emphasis on the learning from complaints, the looking at the systems approach, and also managing expectations, because I think that one of the points I want to make is that as councillors, we're one of the people that receive quite a lot of complaints, and how we handle them probably has a fair bearing on what happens at your end. And I'm aware that I've personally benefited from the ways that particularly with highways issues and grass cutting and so on, the information that we've had to help us manage expectations has been really helpful with the community. And I'm thinking, is this something we can build on? You're presumably getting clusters of particular issues that will be a hot topic in the community at any one time. Getting information to us as councillors so that we can manage complaints better at our end could perhaps benefit your service as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really valid point. It's one that I probably need to take away and reflect on how we might do that. And my initial thought is that actually probably the quicker intelligence of the real hotspots would actually probably come from our customer service centre, because I'd probably be down the line a bit in seeing that. So it might be that feed is better driven from our customer services area, but I can certainly have a conversation with the head of customer services to explore opportunities to improve that.
And then I've got Terry Richards.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick one from me, if I may, Simon. I mean, again, excellent report, and I think the number of complaints we get is a credit, bearing in mind the number of residents we got. But I'd just like to fully understand what we define as a complaint. Now, the reason behind that is the very first comment you made about, quite a lot come in, which, and I've written it down somewhere, which are resolved in the Customer Services Centre. I note on page 94, we've had things like informal resolution by direct contact with departments and things like that. So it would have been useful in the report to have a definition of what we constitute a complaint. So if it's only a complaint because it hasn't been dealt with by the first point of contact, to me it's still a complaint. So, and perhaps you comment on, so if we take the second item in Appendix A of the compliments, now that to me is a complaint. It's ended up being a compliment as well and can be recorded as both, but would we have recorded that one as a complaint?
Okay, so in terms of the definition, our policy gives a very broad definition of a complaint. Something along the lines, I haven't got it exactly in front of me, but any expression of dissatisfaction with council services. So very broad and very, very general. In terms of being, from a pragmatic point of view, as I say, of trying to ensure that that my small team can actually operate and manage volume. What our approach tends to be that if we get reports, we're always looking to see, have we had an opportunity to respond to this yet? So a common one we get is something that will come into that may come in on our complaints web form, for example, from the website. That is something along the lines of, I wanted to report there is a pothole on X Street. no indication it's previously been reported. So in that scenario, although it's come on as a complaints web form, we would obviously acknowledge the customer, refer that back into the customer service centre for them to arrange that inspection. There's two reasons for doing that. A, because that would be the route around requesting that service and would be appropriate. But there is actually quite an important issue there around if I dealt with that outside of that process, that data around the inspection taking place wouldn't necessarily be recorded in our core highways system, which has implications on us defending highways liability claims down the line and things like that. So there are some practical considerations around why first-time reports or apparent first-time reports I do try and push through into that process. So there are so that's some of the reasons why we sometimes do that. If it's couched along the terms of I've made a number of calls and lots of reports around this, I've been reporting this since April, clearly there's wider issues at play there in terms of delay and response, so that would then come in as a complaint. So that's kind of some of the thinking at play. The other areas where we might not deal with it as a complaint are typically around we would always have conversations with people. If often it's couched along the terms of I'm just trying to get hold of X and so who's not returning my calls. We're a firm believer in try and deal with things as quickly as possible, and if we can quickly get them in contact with that person they're trying to do, then we'd look at that as through the sort of resolution within 24 hours, which is specified in our policy as one of the areas we may consider outside of the scope.
Chairman, I wasn't suggesting we changed the process. I wasn't suggesting it came to your team. I was just saying if the first point of contact had resolved it, there's no reason why it still can't be recorded as a complaint if that's truly what it was. And in answer to my question on Appendix A, so would the second item down have been recorded as a complaint, which it is because they're saying we got some lost VA applications. Now it's been resolved brilliantly and it's a compliment as well, but would that have been recorded as a complaint?
Yeah, sorry, I missed that. But I'd need to check the details. My gut feel is it probably wouldn't on that one because it probably would. It depends whether that originally came into us as phrased as a complaint or whether that initial interaction was with the customer service centre. I'd need to check the details on whether that one had or not. But my gut feel is I suspect that's probably not because it probably that conversation earlier was happening with the customer service centre would be my gut feel.
I would just say, Mr. Chairman, in my world, that's a complaint. It's been resolved. I've got no problems with it. But if that's distorting our numbers of complaints that we've received, I have a slight area of concern with that. I mean, to me, there should be 200 complaints dealt with by the customer service team and dealt with in 10 minutes and resolved is just a statistic which could then be in the report. So our number of complaints would be recorded as it should be, as opposed to ones which we then treat as a complaint because it was a complaint which was not resolved first time. So a complaint to me, and most firms across the country now, both commercial and private, now treat complaints as a complaint at first point of contact.
I can certainly do some further thinking around how we can draw some of those numbers that are being handled in as I say in the customer service end or indeed other areas into the report and increase the intelligence. I accept that point, so I'll reflect on that and see if we can improve the intelligence on that.
Just one final observation: even if they were taken into consideration, our complaints are still phenomenally low, and it's a credit to this council, irrespective of that. So I'm not making the point that we're underperforming. We're performing brilliantly. I'm just concerned about accurate reporting, of which is still an infinitesimally small number in the number of calls we have, particularly for those of us that had the excellent briefing last week on the customer services centre.
Okay, I'll take that as a comment. I don't have any other comments from members. I take it we're all happy to note this report. We get this every year, so you can see trends going forward. Thank you very much, Sir Simon, for presenting that. No further items of business. I just would remind members that as it stands, the next meeting is on the 13th of September, 10:30. But as you'll be aware, there has been some discussion about whether it's a bit tight with regard to the strategic frameworks report. So we'll have discussions with the other commissioners and officers about whether there's any scope to move that forward a bit. And we'll let you know. Okay, thank you.